All right, and we are live. Hello, Floodgate family. Welcome back to our fourth edition of Improving Live. I'm Danny Searing.
And I'm Chris Gregory. And Danny and I are thrilled to continue sharing tips and insights that help job seekers. Up to this point this year, we've talked about job seekers' personal brand, how to effectively pursue job postings, and networking. And today we're going to take on maybe the biggest topic of them all, which is interviewing.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, everyone, as always, we are here live. So any questions relevant to really at this point, anything along the interview process, the job search process, but specifically today, we're going to be talking about interviewing. So any questions you have over in the right side, we'll get to those at the end of the session. But interviewing, Chris, right? It's tough. It's it is a large part of the job search process, right? And you can't prepare for everything, right? So going back to section 1 that we talked about a couple of months ago now, your personal branding and understanding, your value add, doing that self-reflection and self-evaluation of your weaknesses, strengths, wins, maybe some learning lessons and challenges you faced along the way. Having that solid foundation is where this all stems from. So I do encourage people, whether it's now or after you watch this, go back, watch that session, because that's sort of the building blocks for everything we're going to talk about here today.
It is. It's the foundation for everything that job seeking includes, and that does ultimately culminate with an interview. But if you don't build the foundation, you're not going to be able to thrive in the interview. So I'm going to step back for a moment and share my view of how I look at a vacant position. Any vacant position that exists, I view it as the hiring manager's problem. And that it can even be for positive reasons. It might be that the previous person was promoted because they did an exceptional job. It may be that the company sees the demand that's there, and so they're adding new headcount. But the best candidates in an interview are able to showcase how they're able to really solve the hiring manager's problem. And a common mistake that I hear or see in feedback from interviews is that candidates, of course, know their own story and they can walk a manager or an interviewer through it. But what they don't do is connect the dots and explicitly show how their abilities, their skills, their experiences, how those things are relevant to the specific role that they're pursuing. And in these, what is almost always universally a competitive interview situation, those small things, the person that can most clearly describe how what they've done is going to be able to solve that problem, that can be the difference between being the runner-up and the person that actually gets that offer.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of mindset for people because often when you're on that job search, it's overwhelming. There's a lot. You're thinking about a bunch of different things. You've got a bunch of different positions you're applying for and interviewing for. If you just take that step back as you're preparing for each specific interview and say, what is their problem? How can I solve it? That's a pretty cut and dry way to look at it. So, and of course, there's multiple layers to interviewing, and this could be a 2-hour session, right, Chris? But we're going to start with sort of our 22, 23 years of being in the med device, MedTech industry, the 4 prominent and universal things that for every position level, every company, any interviewer is going to be looking for and looking to uncover an interview. Again, of course, this is not everything, but it sort of encompasses most of what we've seen. So first, it might sound obvious, but it's important. Can you do the job? So ultimately, you need to be able to showcase the skills, the abilities, the core competencies that are going to allow you to thrive in the job from day 1, but then in year 2, in year 5, and ultimately throughout the remainder of your career is what they're going to be looking for. So like Chris was saying earlier, and we'll beat this to death, knowing your story inside and out and what skills you have up front is important, but not just knowing them, knowing how to bring them to light both at the correct time and in the correct framework to solve that problem that the interviewer might have. So as an example, if I'm interviewing for a position and I learned through the interview process, whether it's early on or later on, that there's an account or health system or physician that an interviewer, a company is struggling to break into or get in front of, rather than just saying, oh, that's something I can do, or, oh, that's something I've done in the past, having a specific example right in the front of my mind of, hey, here's how I've broken into actually that exact account in the past, or more often than not, here's how I've done something similar and how I think that'll translate well into this role, is huge to have sort of on tap to be able to spew out. We hear all the time from hiring managers, one of the most common reasons candidates are disqualified is not because maybe they didn't have the right experience, but they just weren't able to translate what they've done well enough to convince that hiring manager they could do the job.
There's nothing more concretely relevant than here's what I've done as it relates to this role. Here's how what I have done is going to be directly applicable here. You're connecting the dots. You're making it very easy for them to see that. So the more specific those examples you can give, certainly the better. And the next one here is it stands on its own, but it's also directly tied to what we've talked about already. Have you prepared for the interview? The proof is really in your ability to engage with the interviewer in a meaningful way. There's that old adage of, there's no such thing as a bad question. I would say that's not actually at all true in interviewing. If you show up to an interview and ask what the company does, that's a fail. If you show up and ask things that in a 1-minute search of the company's website would be very evident, those aren't questions that are going to show that you've done your homework. But if you ask questions that show that you have, and you have specific questions, there's nothing wrong with not being an expert, but you do want to showcase you've at least taken the time to understand what the company does. And a hiring manager, many times I get feedback that candidate hasn't done their homework. And I genuinely, as a hiring manager, doubt whether or not they're truly interested in this position. And maybe this is oversimplifying, but every hiring manager wants to identify someone who can do the job, to your previous point, and who wants to do the job. So those are very important. Doing your homework and being able to show up well-versed enough to have a conversation is critical.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, Chris, I hear, and I might have fallen victim to this in my past, especially, younger folks or people who are earlier in their career, they feel like they should know everything and are sort of apprehensive to ask questions and don't want to sound, for lack of a better term, stupid or unintelligent. But it's that balance of having good questions to show that interest and show that genuine, excitement about the role, but also, keeping those questions more strategic so it's not looking like you haven't done your research. As a reminder too, we are here live. So anybody that's joined, drop some questions. I see we got a couple there over in the comment section. We'll get those here towards the end. But the third sort of thing to prepare for and that they're going to be looking for in an interview, regardless of the stage in the process, is can the interviewer believe you? Do you have sort of that genuine authenticity that they can use to gauge your interview answers moving forward? Because let's face it, of course, there's reference checks and all that at the end of the interview, but a lot of what they're taking is going to be on face, taking with what you say is on face value. So when you're giving those experiences and wins, if they're not genuine, it's sort of going to go over the head of the interviewer. So we always want to look perfect and show all of our great successes in our career, but let's face it, you're not perfect. And oftentimes a lot of those best stories and experiences come from the challenges that you face, the failures that you face, how you've overcame them, and are going to use them, in roles in the past and in this role moving forward. So being genuine and authentic early on matters so that when you do tell those sort of win stories, they come across a lot more genuine.
Yeah, and a lot of times you simply do learn by failing and having to overcome the next time you're faced with a similar dynamic. So being believable is a huge piece of it. And the last of these kind of initial 4 things that we'll talk about is showcasing emotional intelligence. And that's a bit of a buzzword that's hard to quantify. But what we recommend is when you get into an interview setting, kind of read the room, we'll call it, and try to mirror what the interviewer's energy is, at least relatively closely. Interviewers are typically going to drive the interview. And so you want to let them. You don't want to, take the wheel and dominate the conversation. You want to make sure you listen to their questions, answer thoroughly but succinctly, check in with them to ensure they're still engaged. Because one of the things we hear pretty regularly is that dominant conversation piece where somebody goes for minutes on end, losing their audience along the way. So that's one piece is be able to engage and don't go for too long at any given time. Questions, we talked about that a little bit before, but having questions is important. Unless you're literally in the final interview, have asked every conceivable question and are ready to sign on that offer sheet line, you should always have questions. Again, it kind of shows lack of emotional intelligence. If you show up and say, no, I don't have any questions for you at all, I don't need to know anything else about this, that's generally not a good look.
Yeah, and Chris, it brings up a question I'm thinking. I mean, you talk about emotional intelligence, matching that of the interviewer. How does someone balance? I think what I've heard some people struggle is balancing sort of being themselves, being genuine, and matching the interviewer. For instance, if I'm a super bubbly, outgoing, excited, individual, and I'm interviewing with someone who's a little bit more, stoic, if you will, how do I match their energy but still be myself?
Yeah, it is a balancing act. First and foremost, always be yourself, always be genuine. And energy and enthusiasm are almost universally well-regarded things to showcase in an interview. Having said that, you don't want to be manic, jumping up and down, screaming, your excitement from the mountaintop when you've got somebody who you can't even get to do more than a slight nod. So closely mirror their energy. Don't lose your energy. Don't not have energy. Be true to yourself. But again, you don't want to be wildly different than the other person. At the same time, you may find if that's consistent with your interviews throughout the overall process, and you are a really energetic person and nobody at this company is showcasing those same attributes, you may find it's not the right culture fit for you. But you don't want to sacrifice being genuine and being yourself. And enthusiasm and energy are, again, almost always a good thing, at least up to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think everything's got a scale, everything's got a spectrum. It's dialing yourself, on that right point in the spectrum, whether that's more energetic, less, to match the individual that you're speaking with. So, so those are sort of the 4 different things universally that any interviewer is going to be looking for. So now we'll move on to a hot topic that I get asked about a lot. I'm sure you do as well, Chris, is the different interview styles. We hear it all the time. What's this manager's interview style? How are they going to interview me? So these are sort of the 3 top ones that we see almost universally across the board. So the first is going to be behavioral. And this is definitely more traditional. Probably if you've interviewed before, you've come across this individual or multiple of these at least once. But the idea here is that your past behaviors are going to be indicative of your future behaviors or actions, right? So like we were talking about earlier, tell me about a time when XYZ, when you've broken into a new account or introduced a new product in an account you're already working at. And really what they're looking for here is not just a generalization, but a very specific example to answer the question. This is the perfect example of what we were talking about earlier, where you need to be armed with those examples, because let's face it, when you're interviewing, you've got a lot going through your head. You're thinking about questions. You're nervous. How's my posture? The last thing you need to do is try and think of a story that you don't have prepared while you're sitting in an interview.
Yeah, a lot of times it's that idea of things that you've done before, you're going to be prepared to do again in the future. So if you can give that example of, I did this exact same thing, it shows the relevancies, and it doesn't leave them guessing as to whether you'll be able to do this job. And there is a great method for answering behavioral questions. It's referred to as the STAR method. It stands for situation, task, action, and results. It breaks down in a flow exactly what you've done in a explicit situation to be able to answer that question. So research the STAR method, can find many examples of it, become an expert at it, because these are some of the most typical questions, behavioral, and the STAR method really breaks down great ways to give explicit answers to those types of questions. Mm-hmm. So that's a big one there. Situational style or interviews are a bit tricky because they're more future oriented or hypothetical. The questions may sound something like, how would you handle it if? And these are tough because it doesn't always go back to a past example where you can give that. Here is exactly what I did when I was faced with this. Frankly, candidates can just make up an answer that maybe sounds good and wouldn't necessarily be how you actually behave in your real life. So there's a bit of a pitfall to that. None of these are absolutely perfect ways of going about it, but you do want to be aware that those sort of hypothetical, tell me what you would do here, are types of interview questions that we see commonly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Chris, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but where I've seen these most effective, we see them used all the time, but where they're most effective is typically in more specialized roles where you wouldn't know what to do unless you've done it in the past. So it sort of blends with a lot of times that behavioral, interview style as well, so is what I've seen. And then finally and this is my favorite, but it's the conversational interviewer. Now, this one can be tough and tricky because at face value, it comes across great. Oh, conversational. I could just have a chat with them, be super casual. There's no pressure. I'm not getting drilled with super specific questions, which is true, but it's an unstructured interview format. So there's two things you want to look out for here. One is you might get so caught up in the conversation and other conversations that you might not get asked directly questions about how your experience translates to this specific role. So what I've heard and seen in the past from both candidates and hiring managers is they had a great hour-long conversation, but then before you knew it, time was up and we didn't even get to your experience or why you would translate well. And ultimately, that falls on the candidate for not driving that interview properly. So understanding that you're in this type of interview format is great. Still want to mirror that style, right? But then figuring out ways and reasons to bring up your experience at the right time is crucial. And then the second is conversational, sort of goes hand in hand with more casual. So we've seen candidates in the past pitfall to this. And sometimes it's on purpose by the managers to get them more casual and comfortable and see how they act. At the end of the day, you're in an interview still, right? You're not having a conversation with a buddy at a bar. So being cognizant of that and not falling into more casual ways of speaking or saying things bad about your former employer or other things that you wouldn't do in a normal interview is crucial here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of people who come in and they just start letting the expletives fly because they're really comfortable. And that's probably not the best time and place to really let your guard down. Sales 101, asking for commitment to next step and closing and doing these things. And sometimes when you're super comfortable and you feel like you're talking to just an old friend, sometimes those things unintentionally get chopped off. And that is also, one of the challenges of those type of interviews is you fall too comfortable. Mm-hmm. And the reality too is most interviewers aren't going to pick one lane and 100% stay in it. So every interview is probably going to have some version of, maybe it's conversational by nature, but you may get behavioral or situational questions peppered in. So again, we want you to be aware that these three styles exist. Be prepared to answer those. Again, something like the STAR format can very effectively hit behavioral questions. Situational is a bit tougher. And then, conversational, you sort of see what unfolds, but you need to be aware of it so that you can best prepare to be able to showcase, right skills, abilities, attributes to be able to hit any of the type of questions that get thrown your way.
Yeah. And as you were talking there, Chris, I was thinking one additional thing that, to look out for and sort of prepare for, and this isn't a specific interview style per se, but some interviewers, I know I've seen it in the past, will at some stage in the interview, whether it's early or late, ask a question just totally out of left field that doesn't seem like it translates to the role or the company or the competencies needed to be successful in the position. And in this case, what they're often trying to do is sort of put you on your heels and get you out of that, weed out that professional interviewer and see how you do in sort of an ambiguous environment. And so the point here is to make, obviously there's no way you can prepare for it because it's out of left field, but is to realize that's what they're doing, sort of take a deep breath, take a second to answer it, which is totally fine, and then sort of approach it and not let it shake you up for the remainder of the interview.
Yeah, hopefully you don't get too many of the why does this color represent you type of thing that are totally obscure and there's no right or wrong answer to it. But know that those exist. Simply do the best you can to answer it. Hopefully you won't get too many of them. But the biggest advice that I would give to someone is be prepared in advance. And there's a lot you can do on your own to do exactly that. As we're talking about sales, which is many of our audience out here, if you go to Google and simply type in sales interview questions, there is a never-ending supply of things that you may be able to think about in advance and have your answers for the traditional interview questions that you're going to get. The more prepared you are, the better. And it doesn't mean you want to memorize your answers and that you have, a talk track that is literally scripted, but you want to have talking points that you can always reference back to: your biggest win, your biggest hurdle overcome, your biggest life lesson, what you wish you would have known earlier. All these things you can prepare for. And the more you're ready to go in, the better chance you're going to have of nailing each of those questions over the course of an interview.
Yeah, no, it's all about preparation, right? So I love it. Now we'll sort of do a rapid fire to close here. Some just, again, universal, tried and true tips that for almost every interview are going to be applicable and that we've seen over the last couple of decades, really set candidates up for success. So the first one, we've touched on it a couple of times, but be sure to be prepared to tell the interviewer at every single stage, whether it's your first interview or your last interview, it's still important. What excites you about this company and what excites you about this specific role right now? Because sometimes you won't get that lob question that says, hey, why are you excited about the role in the company? You want to make sure to get that in there because, as we said earlier, people want to hire people who can do the job, but also who want to do the job.
Precisely. So that's a big one. Give them your why right out of the gate. Hit that head on is a great strategy there. Always ask the interviewer if they have any reservations about your candidacy. If they do, you get the chance to hit that head on, address it, and hopefully provide a resolution to it where you can put that kind of question or concern to bed. So always ask them, give yourself the best chance to make sure you've provided clear, concise, and relevant insights to them. Ask them if there's anything else that you can share that wasn't clear along the way.
Yeah, love it. Next, and very important and sometimes nowadays overlooked, we see is be sure to close the interviewer for the next steps in the process. This is sales 101, but it's obviously applicable for sales roles, but definitely for all roles across an organization. Now, don't anticipate or expect them to commit and give you a yes to move on to the next step in the process. That's not critical, but be sure to explicitly ask, like Chris said, do you have any reservations about me? But then also, do I have your endorsement to move on to the next step? I can't tell you how many times and how many people think that just asking, hey, what are the next steps in the interview process is enough. It's not. You need to be explicit in reiterating your interests, asking if there's any questions, and then getting that or trying to get that endorsement to move forward to the next step in the process.
Always close. Sales 101. You can't control what the result is, but you can certainly control explicitly asking for their commitment for that. So yeah, another big one. And then the last of just kind of the tried and true things that we've talked about is the follow-up. Follow-up email should be sent the day of the interview. Do not play it cool and try to send your follow-up a couple days later. One of the worst things you can do is leave a hiring manager guessing about either your professionalism or your interest in the role. And the person that waits a couple days may have already lost their opportunity because they wanted to, thought it was the appropriate way. Follow up the day of the interview. It can be concise, it can be short, but you want to showcase to them, I'm professional with my follow-up, because it's often indicative of how you would behave in front of your customers. So following up right away and reinforcing your interest is critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, we could go on, right, and on, Chris, with different interview tactics, tips, and training.
Interviewing there is no end to how you can, try to get yourself prepared. But hopefully, these are some really great high level and specific things that everybody should be prepared for almost any interview, for any position, whether it's, again, first interview or last interview. They're all hopefully going to be pretty applicable, relevant things here.
Yeah, and it's not a science, right? It's like a lot of things. There's ambiguity. It's an art, but just going in, I think, starting, like you said, with that mindset of how can I solve their problem, and then make sure you're doing all the things along the way to frame it around that is key and going to set you up with success with no matter what role you're going after. So now we've got some time for some questions. We got a bunch come through here, so I'll just sort of start firing down. The first one's from Morgan. How should I explain my job transitions or layoffs? And what's the best way to, reflect this on my resume for an interview? And this is a big one we hear a lot about right now, Chris, with all the layoffs that have gone, through COVID and even most recently. So curious your thoughts here.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in owning your experience. And in some cases in life, we're all very strategic. You have your plans and you work a strategy to go from A to B to C in your career, and it's very strategic. And those are great to be able to explain. Sometimes it's less favorable things, but we're all aware of, or at least most of us know and can empathize, that layoffs happen even to the best of people, especially if you're in this industry long enough. You're probably going to get knocked down at least once. You dust yourself off and you get going. So I'm a big believer in, if it's strategic, showcase that, hey, what I did was with a purpose, with intent, and was strategic. When it's not in your control, own it, say this is what happened. And then at the same time, be able to share what you learned from it and hopefully not find yourself in a similar situation in the future. But to me, the best thing you can do is own it, for better or for worse. Take that accountability. Again, sometimes it falls on you and sometimes it is something that happened to you. But I think hiring managers often like to hire somebody who's strategic and does things with a purpose. So try and paint the picture of what I have done is within my control. And when it's not, simply say it as it is.
Yeah. And I think the key there, right, is ownership. And then also, if, especially for a sales role, it's sort of like getting an objection, hitting it head on before they're able to even come out of, hey, I understand I have a few transitions. Let me just hit that because I know that that's going to be on your mind as we're talking about other things. So let's get that out the way here first and foremost. And I think they'll appreciate that.
Sure.
The next is going to be from Art here. I think I understand. So is it okay to take in an older resume that has experiences, accomplishments, President's Club, and awards older than 20 years? I think he's saying to sort of shorten your resume, if you've got a 35, 40-year career, to maybe not include the first 10, 15, 20 years and sort of focus more on the most recent experience.
Sure. I mean, a resume rather is a snapshot of you that you self-author and create. And so nobody wants to read a 7-page resume. You want to be smart about what you include in it. I think anything that's relevant could and should be included on the resume. Maybe you have a section at the bottom that's just, here are additional jobs that I've had, and then focus on catering the resume to what you're interviewing for. Again, you want your resume and your interview to showcase, how can I solve the problem of this position? If you're chopping out relevant information, even if it was years ago, you're maybe giving yourself less than a full chance to earn the job or earn an interview. So I think it's important to showcase success and relevant experience, whether you go all the way back, whether you do it in different ways of creating a resume and being able to address it in an interview is fine. So there's no one size fits all to that. I think it's looking at what you're interviewing for and showcasing in writing or in the interview that it's relevant information is most important to me.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's tailoring it, realizing what position you're interviewing for, because, if you're, especially late, at a more deep part of your career where you've got 35, 40 years of experience, your President's Club at your first, sales role in 1995 probably isn't super relevant to this position. So having it on there doesn't hurt, but I think in the name of shortening things up and making it easier to digest, you're better off explaining further and spending more time in capturing your last 5, 10, 15 years than you are, making it too long and then information overload for who's looking at it.
Yep.
So love it. Got time for, I think, one or two more. Let's see. This is a good one, and I'm curious to get your thoughts here. From Sarah, we were talking emotional intelligence, right? And sort of mirroring that energy, reading the room. What are the best ways to do this when you're on a phone interview or even a video interview, which is what we're seeing a lot of nowadays?
We are definitely seeing over the last couple of years that becoming a prominent step for many, many companies. And it is harder. You don't get to shake a hand. You don't technically get to look someone in the eye. You might be looking at them through a video, yeah. Not the same as it is. But I think those same rules apply. If you're prepared, if you show good energy and try to somewhat mimic what it is they're doing, is going to hit the mark. But it is a tougher dynamic. It's harder to read body language. It's harder to do those things. So you want to stay positive. In any interview scenario, you can control what you can control. In advance, it's your preparation, knowing and having examples at the ready. You can be energetic and enthusiastic without being manic at the same time. So you still want to show good energy. You still want to show good enthusiasm. You want them to see your why, that you're excited to be there and interview. But it's hard to exactly quantify that. It is called emotional intelligence, and it's a hard thing to be able to absolutely quantify. But you want to be able to always show energy, always control the things that you can control of presenting yourself in the best possible light. But it is admittedly a bit harder to do via video these days.
Yeah, and I do think I heard this somewhere. I was trying to think as you were talking, but you almost through video, especially through phone, have to pump up that energy like 10 to 15% of what it would be in person for it to show through, because it's those facial expressions, it's that sort of tone in your voice. That's the only thing they can go on. So I think that's a really good question. It's a tough one. Being cognizant of it is important. So,
yep.
Well, we're butting up to the end here. So I think that's most of the questions here we got that we hadn't covered already. But super.
And what I'll throw out there is, this is a drop in the bucket for what we could talk about interviewing. There is no end to how to prepare and to do these things. It's a tough world to get into. Reach out to us. We'd love to be there to support you, whether specific questions you have or big picture ideas. You can reach out to us, individually through LinkedIn, our website. We are here to try to provide candidates the best tools to be the best version of themselves. And again, this is not anywhere near covering the topic of interviewing, but hopefully does still give some good insights to those of you out there.
Yeah. And it's been a pleasure to chat here with you over the last 4 segments, Chris. So look
Absolutely.
forward to doing it more in the future. And thanks everyone for tuning in. But this has been our 4th session here of Improving Live. I'm Danny Searing. This is Chris Gregory. Thanks for joining. Take care.